Eysenck is the third most cited psychologist of the 20th century, yet today his name evokes as much caution as it does respect. On one hand, he laid the quantitative foundation for modern personality trait theory and served as the initial catalyst for the entire field of behavior therapy. On the other, his career is marred by catastrophic data retractions, excursions into fringe science, and inflammatory public stances that provoked physical riots. To understand this dichotomy, we have to look at his origins. At the age of 18, Eysenck fled the oppressive totalitarian regime of Nazi Germany. Arriving in the UK, he eventually immersed himself in the London School of Psychology, an academic tradition heavily influenced by Francis Galton that prioritized statistical variation and rigorous mathematical measurement. He adopted a strict, uncompromising philosophy. All human variation is rooted in biology, and therefore it must be mathematically measured. Every triumph he engineered, and every ethical cliff he eventually fell from, stems directly from this single axiom of biological determinism. In the mid-20th century, concepts like extraversion and introversion were largely owned by Carl Jung and his psychoanalytic contemporaries, who explained them through mystical, untestable theories of the mind. Eysenck rejected the idea of the unconscious entirely. To him, if a psychological concept could not be measured in a laboratory, it was not science. He hypothesized that personality traits are dictated by brain physiology, specifically baseline cortical arousal. In his model, introverts possess high baseline arousal, so they avoid loud environments to prevent sensory overload. Extroverts have low baseline arousal, driving them to seek out stimulation. This biological logic became the basis of his descriptive personality framework, the PEN model. The E stands for extraversion. The N stands for neuroticism, which maps a person's emotional stability and the reactivity of their autonomic nervous system to stress. And finally, the P stands for psychoticism, a dimension capturing an individual's impulse control, baseline aggression, and capacity for empathy. By anchoring these traits in testable biological mechanisms, Eysenck transformed the study of personality from an armchair guessing game into an objective psychometric science. He applied this same demand for rigorous measurement to clinical therapy. In the 1950s, psychiatry was dominated by prolonged, unmeasured psychoanalytic talk therapy. Eysenck disrupted this monopoly by publishing an explosive actuarial evaluation of psychotherapy outcomes in 1952. His data showed that patients undergoing traditional psychoanalysis fared no better than those who simply experienced spontaneous, unassisted remission. Though he rarely saw patients himself, he used these findings to champion a radical alternative focused purely on observable actions, behavior therapy. He promoted techniques like systematic desensitization and classical conditioning, demanding that clinicians prove their effectiveness through measurable outcomes. By forcing the field to adopt actuarial standards, he effectively established clinical psychology as an independent, applied science. Eysenck soon expanded his biological paradigm outward. He asserted that general intelligence, or G, is a heavily genetic phenomenon with broad social consequences. He applied this lens to criminology, framing criminal behavior not as a consequence of socioeconomic disadvantage, but as a biological failure of socialization. He drew direct correlations between illegal acts and his own PEN model. He argued that individuals scoring high in both psychoticism and extraversion are genetically predisposed to resist societal rules and conditioning. He even extended this logic to media studies, exploring how televised violence biologically triggers individuals who possess specific trait profiles. In every domain he touched, from crime to media consumption, Eysenck stubbornly prioritized genetic interactions over pure environmental explanations. This commitment led him to pioneer socio-political genetics, arguing that political attitudes are heritable decades before modern molecular genetics could test the claim. He rejected the standard single-axis political spectrum that simply placed socialists on the left and conservatives on the right. This chart shows his two-dimensional mathematical model. The x-axis represents the R factor, plotting radicalism against conservatism. The y-axis represents the T factor, plotting tough-mindedness against tender-mindedness. When he plotted communists and fascists on this grid, he showed that while they are horizontally opposed on the R factor, They cluster tightly together at the extreme tough-minded end of the T factor. This mathematical model demonstrated that extreme political opposites share an identical, heritable psychological architecture of authoritarianism. Eysenck's absolute confidence in his quantitative methods led him to test anything, pulling him into fringe areas like astrology, graphology, and parapsychology. He also provided inflammatory support for theories suggesting a genetic basis for racial differences in intelligence. This specific brand of biological determinism provoked intense backlash, resulting in widespread academic condemnation and physical protests at his lectures. But his most destructive controversy arose late in his career through a health psychology partnership with researcher Ronald Grossarth-Matusek. Together, they published shocking claims that specific personality types were inherently cancer-prone or heart disease-prone. They argued that personality was a stronger predictor of cancer mortality than smoking, a conclusion published while Eysenck was accepting funding from the tobacco industry. Subsequent independent investigations into these datasets uncovered impossible statistical anomalies and gross data manipulation. The consequence of these investigations was devastating. Dozens of Eysenck's peer-reviewed publications were posthumously retracted from major scientific journals. When a scientist becomes so blinded by their own theoretical paradigm that they ignore confounding variables and basic research ethics, the result is corrupted science. How should modern psychology evaluate a legacy defined by both conceptual brilliance and empirical fabrication? His foundational triumphs are undeniable. The Penn model evolved directly into the modern Big Five personality traits, and his demand for actuarial rigor birthed cognitive behavioral therapy. Yet the retracted health studies remain a permanent scar, serving as a severe warning about the dangers of paradigm overcommitment. The ultimate lesson of his career is that rigorous methodology and intellectual honesty must always supersede loyalty to a brilliant theory. Today, Hans Eysenck remains the indisputable architect of modern quantitative psychology, and ultimately, he is its most instructive antagonist.